Hey, I'm John Landis. Welcome to episode 3 of the Apprenticeship, where we're going to continue to cover milling lumber, but we're going to get into the finish milling of lumber. Today we're going to get our hands dirty, so thanks for joining me. Welcome to episode 3. We're going to continue what I taught in episode 1 and 2, but we're going to start to use the knowledge that we picked up in 1 and 2. Now, in the last episode, in episode 2, we were talking about rough milling lumber. And we were talking about this sort of ethereal coffee table that I was supposedly working on. So what I've chosen to do today is pull in an ottoman that we'll put together, and we'll go through the rough milling of the ottoman. It's here so that you can look at it so you can know what I'm talking about. So the first thing we want to do is size up the lumber and make us a cut list so that we know what pieces we need and how many pieces and what sizes we're going to need. So the first thing we're going to do is determine that we are going to need the 4 legs and we need 4 aprons. So the 4 legs, we want to be 1 5/8 or 1 3/4 square, doesn't matter, depends what we end up with. And the aprons, in this case, as we have a drop-in cushion, the aprons are also the same thickness as the legs. So we have the fortunate element of all of the pieces being the same thickness. That'll help us along a little bit. So let's go ahead and make the cut list. So the legs want to be a finished length of 14 inches, and like I said, they're going to be 1 5/8, 1 3/4 square. They're square stock. Yes, they have tapers on them, but as we're milling the lumber, we're going to mill them square. So I wrote down on my list that I need 4 14-inch by 1 3/4 square. Now this is a rectangular ottoman, it's not a square ottoman, so we're going to have 2 sides that are the same length, and the other 2 sides that are the same length as itself. So the first one is shoulder to shoulder. That means the distance between the legs is 12 inches. Plus I intend to put a 3/4 inch long tenon on this side and 3/4 on that side, adding 1.5 inches to the length. So this is going to be 13.5 finished length. I need 2 of those. So I wrote that down, that I need 2 13.5 by 1 3/4 thick as well. And then the width of them is 3 inches. And then my final 2 pieces that I need are these aprons, the longer aprons. These measure at 16 inches shoulder to shoulder. Plus again, I want to do the 3/4 inch tenon and the 3/4 inch tenon, adding 1.5 inches to the length. So I've written that down as 2 at 17.5 inches long by the 1 3/4 thick by 3 inches tall. So let's take this cut list down to the table saw. Let's pull out the lumber that we're going to use and do the rough milling that I talked about in episode 2 to relieve that tension and let these boards move as they're being cut free from the larger boards. And then we'll move on into the finish milling, which will involve the surfacing of one side, surfacing of the opposite side, edge, and then finally cut to length to get us ready for the final mortise and tenon work that we're going to do on these pieces. So let's head down to the table saw. All right, so the first thing I did when I had my cut list together was to go to our lumber stack and try to pick appropriate sizes out of the lumber that I had to do these pieces. Now, this is an ottoman, so all of these pieces are relatively short in the first place, 14-inch legs, and then I think the biggest thing I needed was 17.5 inches for one of the aprons. So those aren't extremely long anyway. I got fortunate in a couple areas. One, I had this short piece here that is going to be wide enough and long enough to do my long side aprons. Remember, I need those to be 3 inches wide in the end, and we're going to rough cut those at 3.5 or 3.25 inches. And if you don't know why, you need to watch episode 2. But I'm going to rip those at 3.25 plus the curve for the blade. So I needed somewhere in the 7-inch wide range for a board. So this one's going to end up perfect for us as far as the long aprons go. I also had this nice board here. you want to talk about perfect use of lumber. This is the outside of the board here. This is obviously not usable for what we want to do here. A little bit of sapwood as well that I don't mind. It's just if we're going to be making something, if the sapwood isn't intentional, I don't really want it in the piece in the first place. So this is going to be good for my shorter aprons. Good in length, and again, out of usable wood, we're talking about 7 inches here. So this is going to be a perfect board for the side aprons. Now, when it came to choosing lumber for the legs, 14 inches is no big deal, but I was out of shorts. I didn't have any appropriate short boards already in existence. So I went to the lumber stack. Of course, I've got 9 and 10 foot boards, 14 foot boards of 8/4 cherry. But I also had this board here, which is about a little over 3 feet. Let me see, about 38 inches. Yep, 38 inches. And it's wide enough that I could get all 4 legs for this ottoman out of this by cutting the 14.5 inches off of here. But I passed on this board, and the reason I passed on it was because if I took the 14.5 inch cut off to use for the legs, I was left with something that was 24 inches, but it's usable. But in my business, in my line of work, and the things that we normally build, I quickly thought in my head, how often do I need a 24-inch board? It's not long enough for a chair back leg. It's too long for chair front legs, but not long enough to do 2. So in my head, I quickly said, you know what, this piece here is more valuable to me as a 3-foot board than it would be as a 2-foot board. So I put this one aside and I didn't take from that one. Instead, I went back to the large lumber pile and I took this 14-inch, I actually took 15 inches because we needed extra length. I took this 15 inches off of a very long board. And the reason I did that was because that left me a long board that I could use in multitude of ways. So as you're going through your project and you have your cut list, go into your lumber stack and make the smartest choice you can so that you're A, not wasting lumber, or B, you're making great choices like where else can I use a board like this that's really gonna need to be cut off in the first place. So that was step 1. All right, so we're here at the table saw. We've got our cut list, we've got our boards, and we're ready to do the rough milling that we talked about in episode 2, which is freeing the smaller boards from the larger boards, relieving the tension, the rough milling process before we start the final milling process. And it's a good thing we're doing that too, because these rough boards are not by any means flat at all. Now, on this board, for example, we could have gone to the jointer. It's narrow enough. We could have gone over our jointer, made this face perfectly flat, could have gone through the planer and planed this down to the 1 3/4 that we want, edge joint, and then we'd be ready to rip. And we could rip these at 1 3/4. But as you found out in episode 2, we would not be left with 4 straight legs at 1 3/4. Those boards are going to flex. So that's why we're here right now doing the rough milling and the over cutting of things. First thing we need to do is set our blade height, which is what we've done here. We've just allowed the gullets to clear the wood itself to allow the sawdust to evacuate and get out of the way so things don't overheat. Also, we've made this blade just as high as it needs to be to minimize blade exposure. That's for safety purposes. All right, so remember, we have 4 aprons being ripped at 3 final dimensions. So we're going to cut this at 3 1/4. We've set that up on our gauge here on the table saw. I'll just do a quick 3 1/4, so we're fine with that. I'm going to rip all 4 aprons, the 2 shorter ones out of this, the 2 longer ones out of this one. Then we're going to reset the fence to the 2-inch. We're going to go with 2 inches because that's what the thickness of the leg board is. And we'll rip out 4 legs at 2 inches and we'll be left with a 2-inch by 2-inch square leg stock. From that point on, we'll move on to the final milling. Okay, so what we've done now is cut all of our pieces from the larger pieces. We've released the tension. These boards have done their moving, and we're ready to do the final milling. Now, if you remember, the aprons are going to be 1 3/4 inch thick. The legs are going to be 1 3/4 square. And while the aprons are going to end up at 3 inches wide, we do have the advantage of the thickness being the same, which means that we can mill all of these at the same time. Now, we're going to get to the point of why we're doing this. Yes, we're going to cover how, and we're actually going to go through the process of milling this, but the why we're doing this. The reason is simple. I've heard other woodworkers say that we're doing this final milling because that's how you do fine woodworking. Well, I don't know that I agree with that. I think you can have fine woodworking done without doing this process. It takes skill, and there are people who are doing it successfully, but for me, the reason we do this final milling, the reason we get into this precision milling is so that what we're doing in the future with these pieces is more precise, more accurate, and better. So if you've milled all of these pieces at the same time and to the same degree, if you've got a perfectly flat face and a perfectly parallel face and a nice 90-degree angle, and you've cut everything at the same time, what you've just done is set yourself up for success as far as the tenons go, as far as any sort of joinery goes. Because the more precise a piece is, the more precise the joinery is going to be. Everything's going to be repeatable. Everything's going to be quicker, more accurate, more precise, and more consistent. So that's why we do final milling. All right, step one in any final milling process is to put the flat face on the board. Now, if we're doing our legs and they're 1 3/4 by 1 3/4, it doesn't matter which face you choose. In the case of our aprons, where we've got 1 3/4 thick but 3 inches wide, we want to flatten the 3-inch wide. You want to flatten the wider face first. Now, how you do this isn't important to me. If you're in a shop that doesn't have power tools and you need to do it with a hand plane, that's fine. Put this on a bench, take your hand plane to it, and give me a nice flat face. How we do it in our shop is with a jointer. Now, if you looked at my quick tip on the jointer, you're going to know how one operates, but I'll cover it really quickly. We have an in-feed table and we have an out-feed table. And in between these tables is a cylinder of spinning blades. Now, the in-feed table is about a 32nd inch lower than the out-feed table. So when we pass our wood over from the in-feed to the out-feed, the blades take off the high points of the wood, but leave the low points alone because they can't reach it. You pass these over the blade often enough, you get to the point where the blades are touching the entire face, shave it all at one time, and you end up with a nice, perfectly flattened face. Okay, so we've come from the jointer and we have one flat face on all of our pieces. The next step is to get a flat parallel face on the opposite side. The way we're going to do that is with the planer. It's similar to the jointer in that it has a nice solid bed and blades. The difference is the bed, in-feed and out-feed are on the same plane, and the blades hover above the workpiece. The way this works is you send the board through, referencing the first flat face that you put on it on the table. The blades hover above and remove material from the top, therefore thicknessing it and providing you with a flat parallel face on all the boards. It's our next step. How you do it isn't important to me. You can do that with hand planes as well. You can do it a multitude of ways, but that you do it is what's important. All right, so now this board is beginning to look a lot different than it did in its rough stages. We have one flat face that was provided to us by the jointer. We have the opposite parallel and flat face that was provided to us by the planer. Now we've got to go on to side number 3, one of these edges. You could do this with a hand plane. In fact, that's probably what the hand plane is best used for, is to put a nice edge on here. We're going to use the jointer. Slightly different this time. We're not referencing the table this time, although the edge is going to, because that's what needs to be made straight. But what we're going to do is reference the fence. We need this edge to be 90 degrees to this. So we've set our fence at 90 degrees to the table. We're going to hold our nice flat face tight against the fence as we're passing it over the blade, which will give us not only the flat face, the flat edge, but it's going to give us the edge that's 90 degrees to the face. And that's what we're looking for. Okay, we're back to the table saw to put our fourth and final face on these boards. We've got the one flat face thanks to the jointer, the opposite parallel and flat face thanks to the planer. We've put this 90-degree edge on here, back again thanks to the jointer and its fence, and we're ready to cut the fourth face. We're going to use the table saw for that. The table is flat, the blade is 90 degrees to the table, the fence is parallel to the blade, and we're going to set that distance at 3 inches for the aprons and rip this board so that all of the boards are going to be exactly the same width. 90-degree cut, all parallel sides, and this is good to go. We'll do the same with the legs except adjust the fence to the same width as it is thick. Okay, so aside from the finished cutting to length, we're finished with the final milling. Now this is a long way from where we started from. Rough milled, tweaked, rocky, unfinished wood to nice, flat, parallel, perfectly uniform boards. Now the importance of this uniformity is that when we're cutting the tenons in all of these aprons, all of those tenons are going to be nice and precise. They're going to be perfectly parallel faces on the tenons because it's perfectly parallel faces on the faces of the board themselves. The leg stock is going to have perfectly 90-degree mortises going into those legs because the faces are 90 degrees to the next face beside it. So everything's going to be super precise. That's why we do the final milling. So whatever project you're on, whether it's an ottoman like we were doing or a table or whatever it is, make sure that you take the time to precisely mill all of your pieces at the same time if you can, but at least make sure they're done to the same dimensions if that's what's applicable to your situation. It's going to make everything you do from this step on more precise, more perfect, more repeatable, and a better product. Look for us in episode 4 where we're going to start to talk about joinery. We're going to hit the basics first and then we're going to move on to the more complex joinery, and this is the kind of thing that's going to have to get you out of your armchair because you're going to have to get into the shop and try it yourselves. Thanks for watching.